there's some things, specific things that you asked for, and that's a discussion of what's going on in Venezuela. And here, I think it's going to be really important to recognize a couple of things. The Trump administration is once again insisting that this is about drugs. It is not about drugs. This is, again, an attempt to take people of color and label them, for Americans who are not paying terribly close attention, as bad guys. They're drug dealers, they're murderers, they're rapists. How many times have you heard that? And the same thing is true with these immigration sweeps, where it turns out the vast majority of the people they're sweeping up have not been convicted of crimes. This is an attempt on the part of people like White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller to get rid of people who are not white in the United States. And that's a whole different story that is thoroughly anti-American. But they are not going after drug dealers, and you know this for a couple of reasons. If you listen especially to White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt, she talks about drugs, and then she switches right into talking about illicit fentanyl. But in fact, the boats that they are striking primarily in the Caribbean, come from Venezuela, or at least they allegedly come from Venezuela. And Venezuela, the traffickers, drug traffickers out of that region of the world, first of all, mostly use the Eastern Pacific. All right, so if you look at a map, you see they mostly use the Eastern Pacific. Venezuela does not produce fentanyl. In fact, Mexico produces fentanyl, and it comes into the United States in a different way. The countries that produce cocaine. The argument is that these Venezuelans are producing these drugs that are killing Americans, and they're implying that that's fentanyl. But in fact, these boats, if they are carrying drugs, are almost certainly carrying cocaine. Cocaine does not come from Venezuela primarily. Cocaine comes from Colombia and Ecuador. So hitting these boats, which are small boats that are almost 1,000 miles from the United States border, is going to do absolutely nothing to actually address issues of fentanyl. And those boats are almost certainly not headed for the United States. They are probably headed elsewhere. So if that's the case, what is going on here? And I think there are a couple of things going on, and I don't think you can discount one of them, which is this idea coming out of the United States and this thing that this ideological construct I just described, that some people are better than others. And the image of that was always the American cowboy. We're going to hit first and we're going to think later because we're the guys who really understand how to do things. We're better than everybody else. We're just going to flex our muscles. And you see that I think in a really big way with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who's made it clear he believes that the laws of war, for example, or the Geneva Conventions are wussy, that you can't really fight a war unless you just can do anything to your opponents. And I have to say, it's a bit of a digression, but there was a man in my profession, a historian, who had been an interrogator in World War II. And really interesting because he was dead set against this whole torture stuff, this whole we're going to flex our muscle stuff, because he said the way you got information out of the Nazis was you got them to trust you over things like playing chess or something. And I'm going to make this part up. You would say something like you'd play chess for a while and you'd make a move. And I forget who the guy was that he got information out of, but he said, and he'd laugh and he'd say, oh, my son did that once. So you'd know he had a son and you'd know his son played chess, and just things like that, that's how you extracted information. It was an intelligence game. It was not I'm going to hurt you so badly, you're going to say whatever I tell you to. Well, this idea that we're going to throw the first system out and resort to this, swaggering, I'm going to inflict harm system is, I think, at least in part what we were seeing with this idea, we're simply going to blow people out of the water rather than stop those boats and take those people back to the justice system where they can be interrogated, among other things, which is what we've always done in the past. And one of the things that we have done by blowing these people out of the water is we have made Colombia, which had been very cooperative in trying to stop shipments to the United States, stop sharing any information with us. So that's not helping, right? You also know this is not about drugs because of the fact that Trump just pardoned a convicted drug dealer in the United States who had been bringing lots of cocaine into the United States. Trump just pardoned him, and he's pardoned 2 other major drug dealers as well, including Ross Ulbricht, who was the guy who came up with the Silk Road dark web. So you know it's not about the drugs. It's partly about flexing muscles, but it's also about something else. And this is the piece that I'm watching in a way that that I may be wrong, absolutely may be wrong. But I'm really interested in it because it certainly seems to me as if the Trump administration is throwing overboard the post-World War II idea that America needed alliances. That the way you kept Americans safe, which you can never forget, is the primary reason that we have governments, to keep us safe. We tend to forget that in the United States because we have been so safe. But that's why you institute governments in the first place. And then it does other stuff as well, but that's number one. And after World War II, there was this idea that you created safety for nations, first of all, by sharing intelligence. I talked to Senator Mark Warner from the Intelligence Committee this morning. It's recorded on YouTube and here on Facebook. It was really very interesting about what he had to say about the intelligence communities. So you share intelligence and you also develop peacetime. That's really important. Peacetime treaties, defensive treaties, so that, for example, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, is the organization where countries say, we're all banded together, especially Russia, but other countries as well. So if you think you're going to whack one country, just so you know, we're all coming for you. You hit any one of us, we're all going to come and hit you. And as a result, those NATO countries don't get hit, or they haven't in the past. Now that Trump is pulling back from them, you're seeing Russians wiggle into places. They just blew up a train line in Poland. It's a NATO country. And there were just a couple of drone attacks on a plane that Volodymyr Zelensky, the leader of Ukraine, was in today. You're seeing them creating trouble in other NATO countries, clearly pushing the envelope to see whether or not the United States and other NATO countries will step up. So I think you see Trump backing away from that and putting in place something different. And that something different appears to be from a speech that Marco Rubio gave shortly after Trump took office, Marco Rubio now being the Secretary of State, an emphasis on what they call the Western Hemisphere. They seem to be deciding that the United States should control the North America, which explains some of their hostility toward Canada, like one of our best friends, Canada. I mean, Canada tracks Santa Claus, right? And Greenland, and which is a Danish related nation, island nation. You see that, and you also see them really putting pressure on a number of different countries in South America. So not just, although we're all paying attention to Venezuela right now, where the leader Maduro is not a good guy, but you also saw Trump bailing out Argentinian President Javier Milei to the tune of at least $20 billion with a B dollars, and quite likely much more than that. There was also another major payment and a backstop set of loans to make sure that he got reelected. And we have played around in another election recently. And of course, one of the drug dealers that Trump just pardoned was the former president of Honduras, whose party is running for reelection as well. And it certainly looks as if the real pressure that Trump is trying to put in Venezuela is not really about drugs. It's about trying to create enough pressure on Maduro with the idea that the United States might go in and do land hits as well, that they will overthrow him and put in place a government that is amenable or more amenable to American investment in that country, including, you know where this is going, into its oil. That idea of reorganizing the world, the globe, along the idea of spheres of influence is one very much embraced by Vladimir Putin of Russia. But what it also does is it takes us back again to a world that looks very much, by the way, we're in a wicked windstorm here. I might lose connection. But it takes us back to a world of the 1890s and 1900s, a period when a very few people ran the United States of America. And the United States of America wasn't really interested in the world at that point. So there isn't really a parallel there to the way America was reacting to the rest of the world. But it takes us back to an idea really before we had a government that was based in the idea of democracy, in the idea of democratic movements, and in the idea of alliances that could protect us around the world. Lovely to be back, by the way. My schedule is nuts now because I'm traveling all around the country trying to talk to people in person, but it does make it hard to keep any kind of a schedule at all. So anyway, let me get right down to business here. And one of the things that I'm going to ask you to do today, while everybody is so concerned about the everyday of the politics that are happening in this country, one of the things that I'd love for you to do is to try and, while I'm talking, divorce yourself from the immediacy of, oh my God, what's going to happen next? And try to see it from an eagle's viewpoint, so you can take a look at the political machinations and say, oh, I get it, as opposed to thinking, but what are they going to do next? Because I think what that does is it really helps you to think about what might come next and what your role might be in making sure that the future you want is there. So let's start, first of all, with primaries. People have asked where we got primaries and what the primaries are all about and what's going on, et cetera, because today, as I am speaking, the primary in New Hampshire is underway. And they're a mess. Primaries are like, what on earth's going on? And what's a primary and what's a caucus and what's all that stuff going on? Well, the history of the primaries and the caucuses is this. You have to start from the premise of the fact that political parties are not part of our government. And that sounds stupid. It sounds like such an obvious thing. You're like, well, of course, but then wait a minute, they sort of are. So how does that happen? When the framers put together the Constitution, they did not expect that the people who supported the American Revolution would divide into parties, or what they called factions. They believed that people would make short-term alliances over specific issues, and those alliances would fall apart when that issue was resolved, and they would form different ones. And they're really quite articulate about this. This is why James Madison's Federalist Number 10 is so famous, is because it's in Federalist Number 10 where he says, hey, you don't have to worry about there becoming major political juggernauts in this country, because people will break down the same way that they break down religiously, and there'll be different factions, and nobody will manage to take over the system. Rather, like somebody explained it to me once, like a faculty meeting. If you're in a really small department, it's easy to divide into two halves, but if you're in a department of 350, it's very hard to divide people in two ways. You basically have a bunch of little factions, and that way they keep each other in balance. So the framers did not expect that there would be political parties. So once we get the rise of political parties, and I'm not going to go through all this right now, although it's a really interesting story, and maybe someday I will, but let's get to how we get to primaries, because if you think about the idea of political parties in the 19th century especially, what happened was leaders would decide who the presidential candidates were going to be, and they do it through a number of different ways, sometimes through nominating conventions, sometimes at the conventions themselves. And this you saw a lot in the middle of the 19th century, where there would be people would get them to make speeches for one person or for another, and eventually they would all come down to deciding to stand behind one person. Well, what happens by the early 20th century is that it really appears that the political system has been taken over by the politicos. And the ordinary people say, hey, no, we want to have a say in what we get to vote for president. So you start to see in the early 20th century, during the progressive era, the idea that ordinary voters should have a say in who gets to run for office and who gets to be the standard bearer for their party. But those are still, in the early 20th century, just kind of a litmus test for the people running the parties to see whether or not they should run with one person or another. After 1968 and the sort of crisis of 1968, especially in the Democratic Party, then we get the idea of a binding caucus and a binding primary, the idea that a presidential candidate starts to garner votes, from within the party, and that those are binding. It's not just an advisory idea, it's a binding idea. Okay, so now there's a couple things to remember about the primaries that are important, and the caucuses. So the difference between a primary and a caucus is that generally, because remember, there's no rhyme or reason to this, the state parties can act however they want, and the national parties can act however they want. They do have rules and regulations that are voted on periodically. I've read a lot of them a few years ago for various stupid reasons, but they are changeable, and state parties can do things slightly differently than the national party if they want to, so they have their own ways of doing things. But anyway, generally a caucus is, they're both run by the parties, but a caucus is where the parties will get a bunch of voters together and have them express their preferences for a candidate or not, either by voting or by standing in one's place, or by show of hands, in some way saying, hey, I like A, I like B. The parties both argued that they were going to democratize. That is, they were going to let more voices into the party. But they did it in really different ways. So the Democratic Party said, okay, we really need to be much more representative of Americans, so we're going to let a whole new bunch of people vote. We're going to make sure that on our committees we have lots more women, lots more African Americans. We're going to really democratize this. And what they get from that is 1972, and what is sort of the debacle of 1972, when the Democrats nominate George McGovern, who loses every place except Massachusetts and the District of Columbia, which is just one of the biggest the biggest blowout in American history. So after that, they add what are called superdelegates, and those are people from within the governmental system, in the Democrats in the governmental system, who can say, no, we're never going to be able to get this person through. So they are senators, former governors, people who are a weight against that popular voice. The Republicans do something very different, and the reason that this, you'll know in a minute why I'm emphasizing this. The Republicans do something different, and what they do is they front load their caucuses into low information states. And the reason for that is because they can say, hey, look, we're letting everybody have their say, but they know that in low information states, people will tend to vote based on name recognition. So that's why they expected in 2016, for example, that Jeb Bush was going to be, up front and center, because it was a name people knew. And then, of course, Donald Trump comes in like a wrecking ball because he's a name people know even better. So that's the history of the caucuses. And the reason that we are now where we are, in terms of the Democratic Party, people have asked, what on earth's going on with the Democrats? Why aren't they in New Hampshire and Iowa? But they sort of be in New Hampshire and they sort of appear to be in those states, but they're not really. What's going on? Under Biden, the Democrats have switched their first official primary to South Carolina. So they're previously they had been in New Hampshire and Iowa, and they switched to South Carolina. And this, of course, has infuriated people in Iowa and New Hampshire. But the reason they did it is twofold. One, because they said quite accurately that Iowa and New Hampshire, with their heavily white older populations, are not representative of the nation. But crucially, they're also not representative of the Democratic Party. So South Carolina actually has a demographic that's much more like the Democratic Party. That is much more many more people of color, especially Black Americans. So they did it for that reason, but they also did it because it was South Carolina that put President Joe Biden over the top in his primary in 2020. So there's a sense that this is sort of his base, and so there's also something personal about saying, okay, we're going to let you be the first in the nation. It doesn't have to stay there in the future, but that's what they have done, and that's why they've done it. Okay. So, so somebody just asked, was this ridiculous because people in New Hampshire are unhappy? Not really, I don't think. I mean, honestly, it seems like it's a really big deal right now because everybody's reading about the primaries in the papers. And honestly, I'm probably going to get a million things of hate mail. Who really cares about the primaries? You know, I know everybody's hot under the collar about it now, but before you think too much in the future, how many primaries can you really remember? I actually think it's not a huge deal, but whatever. Anyway, so that's what's going on with the primaries. And that was the first question you asked. But let me back off a little bit and talk much more generally about where we are and how we are in the position we're in this bizarro election. Okay, so let's start back in 2015, and you could even start much earlier than that, but let's start in 2015 when you have the Republican Party, which is essentially a party that has really embraced the idea that the way that you make society work really well is that you turn it over to individual, essentially businessmen, to run it how they see fit, because they're much more efficient than the government is. They are, the argument goes, they rise based on merit. And mind you, I'm making this argument because I think you have to understand people's arguments. That doesn't mean I'm advocating for it. It means that I am explaining what they were thinking. And their idea since 1981 had been to cut taxes and to cut regulations, with the idea that if you concentrated money at the top of the economic scale, those people with money would use it really efficiently. And they would use it most efficiently to do things like build new factories, and that would provide more jobs for people, and there would be more money, and that would produce more tax dollars, and therefore the economy would really just sort of boom based on cutting taxes and cutting regulations, so those people could act however they wished. You did not want to have a basic social safety net because that would misuse that money that otherwise could be put back into the economy. So they were busy from 1981 slashing the basic social safety net, slashing infrastructure, and also cutting taxes and regulation. But the problem as early as 1986 was that they recognized that people didn't like it. They liked Social Security, they liked Medicare, they liked roads and bridges, they liked all that stuff, and they didn't like the fact that people at the very top were getting extraordinarily rich. And the money was actually moving upward really dramatically after 1981. So again, as early as 1986, the Republican Party really grabbed hold of people that they could motivate based on either racism or sexism, traditional values they called it, but these tended to be white evangelical Christians or traditionalists who didn't like the idea of women having equality in society. But the trick was, and they said this, the trick was that those people were supposed to provide the votes. And they would provide the votes in exchange for promises, for example, to get rid of Roe v. Wade, or to make sure that there was prayer in schools, or to, do any number of things that the traditionalists wanted. But the trick was they were only supposed to provide the votes. Okay, so how did we get to where we are? Of course, when Donald Trump runs for president, gets the nomination in 2016, he empowers those people. So now you have a Republican Party that has basically been turned on its head. So rather than simply taking the votes of these people, they are now in the driver's seat through people like Donald Trump and Steve Bannon, one of his advisors, and Steve Miller, another one of his advisors. They are now the face of the Republican Party. But here's the kicker and how we got to where we are. And remember, Trump gave that old guard, if you will, the tax cuts they wanted in 2017, and he is promising more tax cuts going forward. He's promising to cut Social Security and Medicare. He's promising to do those things he wants. But those, you can't get votes that way. You get votes by turning out that white evangelical base. That is his strongest base. They turn out in huge numbers. They are the central Republican base now. So if you're a Republican, what are you going to do? Because you need that base. You must have that base on board. You can't simply go back to, oh, we're going to cut taxes and cut Social Security and everybody's, come along with us and we promise you someday we'll end Roe v. Wade, because they ended Roe v. Wade. That's not a stick any longer or a carrot any longer. That's done. So now what are you going to do to turn out that base? And that's the problem for the Republican Party, is that old guard, that guard that wanted the low taxes and the deregulation and all that, they would love to be back in power. And this is one of the reasons that people like the Koch family has been putting money behind Nikki Haley, the former governor of South Carolina, because they believe that she is much more like them than she is like Trump. But she is not putting distance between her and Trump, because she needs those voters too. So anybody who is running for the Republican Party right now must try and get Trump's voters in order to get that base, or so they are behaving. So somebody wrote and said, well, what could Nikki Haley have done? Nothing, because if she's going to get that base, she has to appeal to Trump's base. But at the same time, she's sort of a wink and a nod to the old guards, saying, well, I'm really much more like you. But you can't get the voters based on that. And here's the other problem for the Republican Party, and that's that base, those base voters, that loyal base is never going to switch away from Trump. They're his at this point. And this was the big question going into what year are we in? 2024. Going into 2023, after 2022, a number of us kept saying, will they jump away from Trump to somebody Trump-like? And people didn't really know. And now I think it's pretty clear they will not jump away from Trump. Trump is their candidate. And if he isn't running, they're not going to turn out. And if they don't turn out, the Republicans are dead in the water. So that's the problem for the Republican Party, is that aside from any of their beliefs, aside from anything that they might personally want to do, they are, what is it, the expression? They're like a pig with their tail in a crack, because they have to try and pull those Trumpers and try and keep the rich guys happy. And you can't do both of those things. So what are they going to do? There's a couple other things that are really interesting to me about this. So one of them is that, I'm sorry, let me go into it this way. So basically they're lining up behind Trump. But a number of us have been saying for a long time that that's a real problem. So because Trump is in trouble on 91 counts, he's got these legal cases, but even more for people like me watching it, if you've been watching Trump, he is mentally falling apart, and you can't really miss it anymore. I'm sure you've seen it around the news today, and that's not going to get better. So now they've lined up behind a guy who's in real mental trouble. He doesn't look good, he doesn't sound good, and at the same time, he's got these legal cases that are hanging out there as well. And a number of people who sort of are holding their noses and saying, yeah, I could vote for him, but a conviction would change my mind. That's a real problem for the Republicans. So I'm surprised that Ron DeSantis dropped out, but I'm not surprised if you look at his finances, because his finances were crazily managed, as in he spent more money on private planes than he spent on advertising. I mean, he just didn't run a good campaign. But people keep saying that Nikki Haley is going to drop out. She'd be crazy to drop out, because it is. We have a number of months still between now and the election, and Trump is not looking good. Trump is not looking good. So if he falls by the wayside and she's the last person standing, she could very easily pick up the nomination. And that is one of the questions people asked. What happens if he gets all the votes and then he's not able, and for whatever reason, to get the nomination, to take the nomination? Well, hasn't really happened before. We certainly have seen it in the '64 election with the Democrats, when Hubert Humphrey really got it was not fair what happened to him with LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, pulling out of the nomination process after a number of the primaries were already gone by, because Humphrey was running as his vice president then, and then he had to step forward. And a lot of people said, wait a minute, you weren't, how on earth do you suddenly get the delegates? We didn't vote for you. We voted for the other guy who dropped out, and that's why there was the big fight over the other people running in 64. But no, not 64, 68. Is that right? Yeah, 68. Yeah, 68, I think. I'm sorry, I'm messed up in my years because I'm going back and forth so much. It's going to bother me, Val. 68. There we go, 68. Sorry about that, 68, not 64. So they are now, for all that you're reading, oh, Trump's inevitable and all that, part of the reason that Trump is trying to look inevitable, and remember, people behind him and look inevitable, because the minute he doesn't look inevitable, he's in real trouble. And so you can see them really trying to push that idea that he is inevitable. Now, the other thing that is on the menu here is dirty tricks. So one of the things that I'm watching very closely, and think about this. The Republican Party is not trying to win the 2024 election. Think about it. They're not trying to appeal to people who might otherwise not vote for them. So, for example, as we know, a very recent poll says that 69% of Americans want to see Roe versus Wade reinstated. 69%. That's huge. That's almost 70%, right? That's almost 7 out of every 10 people want to see Roe v. Wade reinstated, and I think it's 12 or 13% who want no abortion under any circumstances, which is minuscule. 10 to 13%. That's not even 2 people out of 10. But the Republicans are doubling down on the idea of an abortion ban across the country. So clearly they're trying to cement that extremist white evangelical base to them. But what does it mean to run an election where you basically say to voters, screw you, we don't care what you want, we're going to do it our way, which is what a number of state legislatures have done as well. When the states have voted, state voters have voted, for example, for nonpartisan districting, or for abortion rights, or for many of the different petitions that people have put on the ballot, states have said, well, we're not going to let you petition anymore, or we don't care that that's what you voted for, we're going to do it our way. So if you are not planning to reach out to voters, and you're not planning to change your extremist message, what is your plan for winning in 2024? That keeps me up at night. So what is the plan for winning in 2024? Well, I think you can see a number of pieces moving. First of all, Trump is already talking about the vote being rigged. Now, mind you, there have been some polls, I've talked about how the polls are not reliable. Some polls have said that Trump is ahead. Many have said that Biden is ahead. And most people will tell you that most polls are not worth reading at this point. But I think he's really trying to push the idea once again, as he said in New Hampshire within the last few days, the only way he can lose is if the vote is rigged. That's part of his whole attempt to destabilize the country and make people not believe that the elections are fair. And of course, for all the lawsuits and all the recounts and everything else that happened in 2020, the only thing that's been turned up is miscounts that favored Trump that hurt Biden. There was a case in Virginia, came out about a week ago, in which Biden's numbers were undercounted by 4,000, not Trump's. And the voter fraud you have seen, which, by the way, is different than election fraud. Voter fraud is individuals. Election fraud is trying to steal an election. That's also been on the side of the Republicans, not on the side of the Democrats. So I think he's trying to convince people that the election has been stolen, as he did in 2016 and in 2020. I also think that the Republicans are trying to manufacture an immigration crisis. And you can see this. You can see it all around you with the screams about how terrible immigration is and Biden's not doing anything and on and on and on. Well, Biden's doing a lot, but he has repeatedly asked, and I would go so far as to say begged Congress to provide more money for border security, more money for processing migrants, emphasizing, trying to work with Mexico so that Mexico handles a lot of the people who are pouring from other countries through Mexico, including the people from Venezuela, for example, trying to stabilize countries. He's really trying his best to do things. And now, of course, the Senate has come up with a bipartisan immigration deal that the House Republicans just say, no, we're not going to look at it, because they want to turn out people to vote for them, to vote for this extremist party based on their threats of immigration. And as you know, it's kind of a joke at this point that there's always caravans coming across the border during election season. And you've seen all the statistics that Biden and Obama both deported more people than Trump. Flooded with disinformation. And I don't just mean disinformation from the radical right, which you see already on, for example, with the House Oversight Committee and the House Judiciary Committee, which have been salting the media for months now with innuendo and allegations about Joe Biden's alleged relationship with China, for example, even though we know Trump has admitted he took $7 to $8 million from China while he was in office. And he said, well, I didn't do it for nothing. They were paying me for what I was doing for them. Biden has none of that. And this you've seen probably today, in yet another secret or, private, not public, private, I guess, deposition of one of Hunter Biden's associates. The committee once again went in front of the cameras and was full of, said this guy had access to the White House and all sorts of things. And he and his lawyer came out yesterday and said, you need to release the whole transcript because you've done it once again. My access was I went to the Easter egg roll or something like that. And that transcript came out today, and there's nothing in it. But so I think you're going to see it, not only that disinformation, not only from elected officials who are trying to spin the system, but also you've asked me about what's happening with Fani Willis in Fulton County, Georgia. And that's something I've been watching really closely. And that too today, you have to remember that the person who made the accusations without evidence was an opposition researcher who had worked for Trump, who was up to his eyeballs in trying to get the election overturned, and who is famous for what he has called fraud and I wrote it down here. I don't remember. Here we go. Dirty tricks. And so once again, there's been this huge blow up of, oh my God, Fani Willis must have done something wrong. And maybe the person the issue is that one of the people that she appointed and she's paid her part of this investigation into the people who tried to overturn the election in Georgia in 2020, the presidential election. One of them, allegedly, she is having a personal relationship with. Documents were unsealed in his divorce today, and the people who've read them say there's absolutely nothing there. Even if there is, there's nothing improper about it because because they're both on the same team. He does have a very impressive resume. So this is one of those things I think that you can put under the category, until we learn more, of salting the media with as much crap as you can throw at the wall, with the idea of undermining the cases against Trump and his people and our judicial system. So remember that the accusations there, which do not have any, there's a credit card receipt in which the guy, whose name is Nathan Wade, I think, bought airline tickets and cruise tickets, and listed her as the person taking the cruise. That's it. That's all that, that's all the smoking guns there are. So I think that you're going to see disinformation from anything that we'll throw to the wall. And also, do not forget that Iran, Russia, and China, we already know, are flooding the United States with disinformation. And one of the things about it that I wanted to speak to is that it's very difficult to tell what is real and what is not. It is very difficult. So last night, I actually wrote a whole section of my letter, and I was mad at something that I thought the Biden administration had done, because it was over a byline that looked to me really legit. I mean, it was somebody who was in a legit place. And when I went to cross-check it, the only places I could find the details that this person had quoted were in Newsmax and, the really far-right stuff. And when I tried to chase it down, I couldn't find it. And I thought, that's really interesting, because even I, as careful as I try to be, maybe it's real, but you could not have proved it by me. And I'd actually said to Buddy, I can't believe they did this, and here's the numbers, and here's all this. And about 45 minutes later, I was like, I take it all back. I fell for it. So one of the things that I would suggest that you do always, even for me, I mean, if I'd put that in the newsletter, you'd have thought it was real, is take a deep breath. Before you sit there and say, I'm going to chase this down and see where it's from, just take a deep breath. If there is something that infuriates you because it sounds outrageous, it probably is. And with the caveat I would put in there, the warning that I would put in there, is that, to my mind, there are now people in our public life to whom I believe I can listen. And yeah, I still need to check them, but I trust them if they speak. And there are other people that I don't trust. Marsha Blackburn says something is true, I assume the opposite. Jim Jordan, I assume the opposite. James Comer, don't even start me, man. That guy, he makes it up all the time, right? But there are people whom I trust. So when somebody like Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, speaks, I listen. That doesn't mean I'm not going to check, but it means I do think it is possible for people to have earned our mine anyway, respect enough to say, if Liz Cheney says something, I'm going to assume that she is right unless I check and she's wrong, because I trust her voice. Another person that I'll speak that I've never mentioned before, but I did a show yesterday with Sarah Longwell from the Bulwark. She is a conservative activist. She is a political scientist. We probably disagree about a lot of stuff. But if Sarah Longwell says that something is true, I don't really feel the need to check it, because I trust her. I trust her. So take a deep breath, think about it. And certainly they can make mistakes, at which point I would fully expect that if I said to her, hey, wait a minute, your numbers don't work here, she would say, oh my God, you're right. And I'll fix it. But always take a deep breath and remember that anybody who is trying to get you to react really quickly almost certainly does not have your best interest at heart, because they want you to react really quickly. Now, as I say, Iran, Russia, and China are working really, really hard to separate Americans, to make us lose faith in our democracy, and to make us give up on it. to say whatever, we might as well just go with a strong man. And this is in political terms, but also in, and I think the way to think about it, a form of warfare. Even though it's not a hot war, they certainly don't wish us well. So, if you need to think about yourself as a little soldier in this war, saying, I'm going to check that before I get mad at my neighbor, or before I get mad at my governor, before I get mad at my president, I'm gonna fight back by saying, wait a minute. Before I believe X, let me see what actually happened. And I think that's an important thing to remember. So now a couple more questions you have asked about. Yes, Trump is cognitively impaired. I don't think there's any doubt about that. People have asked me repeatedly, having spent some time with President Biden lately, is he cognitively impaired? No, I do not believe he is. I think he's a very, very sharp man, intelligent-wise. He's very kind in person, not mean. He does have a speech impediment, and that makes him talk more slowly than somebody like me. But he also has a really, really, really crackerjack good team around him. So I think they're just aging very differently. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I look at Trump, and I used to watch old videos of him, and he was very sharp. He was funny, he was quick, he was, he played his audiences and I thought he was actually slipping a lot by 2016, but now it's really marked, as I assume you have seen. All right. So that's one question you asked. Should Trump be able to run for office under the 14th Amendment? And I'm going to answer this the same way I did before. The meaning of the 14th Amendment to the people who wrote it is extraordinarily clear, and under that, absolutely not. That's the historical answer. But the legal and the political answer is something different than that altogether. And actually, let's throw out the political answer, because I think we should go with whatever the legal answer is. And lawyers like Terry Canfield have pointed out that it's not that clear how that was supposed to be executed in the Constitution. Now, great thinkers like Judge Michael Ludig and Lawrence Tribe from Harvard have both said, hey, it's supposed to be self-executing, which means that you don't have to have Congress pass a law or anything else. It just is, the same way you can't run for president if you're 22. But there are debates over that. So should he be able to run? No. But I'm going to go back now historically to the idea that the framers did not expect political parties, because if indeed you believe that lawmakers will do what is best for the country rather than what is best for the party, Donald Trump would never have been in office in the first place. And certainly he would never have made it through his first impeachment, in which all of the senators, according to Ted Cruz from Texas, believed that what he had done was exactly what the House charged him with. That is, tried to extort help in the 2020 election from President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine before he would release monies that Congress had appropriated to give Ukraine to help fight off the 2014 invasion by Russia. And that was part of our national security. And that's breaking lots of laws. So, which you don't have to do, by the way, to be impeached and to be convicted. I've talked about that before. But somebody just asked if Ted Cruz was reliable. Absolutely not. Ted, just don't even start me. Ted Cruz is pushing his podcast. He doesn't even care about governing anymore. Literally, he says stuff on the floor of Congress so he can then go say it on his podcast. Anyway, so if we didn't have that political system where, for example, in 2019, Mitch McConnell, who was then Senate Majority Leader, told his people, listen, this isn't about Trump, it's about the 2020 election. So just shut up and vote, that you're going to acquit him. The framers could not even have begun to think about that, because they didn't understand that we were going to have political parties. And now, of course, we've got this political party that is defending Trump beyond, people say, should we have had a president who's possibly committed crimes or all that? No, this never could have happened. This never could have happened without this, this extraordinary loyalty to this political party and how this has built up. All right. So now the other question that I think you need to know is that so he should, the framers would have said no, this would never happen. Nobody would turn to a criminal, and at this point, of course, he has been found liable for rape. I'm sorry, sexual assault. But then the judge said it is what a normal person would consider rape. But the New York laws are very, very specific about that. And for fraud, that just is a non-starter for that kind of criminal behavior is a non-starter from the framers. But now, of course, Trump is arguing that he should have presidential immunity for everything that he had done, that he did as president, or after. And that's, I think it's or after. And that's just, again, an absolute historical non-starter. The whole point of setting up a government based in the law rather than in heredity was to make sure that we would not have a king who could get away with whatever he wanted. And so what Trump is essentially arguing is that he should become a king. All right. You also asked about, so what if Trump is found guilty after he is elected? This is a real problem because, as you probably are aware, the Judge Eileen Cannon in Florida, who is in charge of the documents case in which Trump retained national security documents, highly secret national security documents, when he was not allowed to have them, it seems pretty clear she's not going to let that come to trial before the election. And that was always the case that to me looked incredibly strong, not least because they had all the paperwork, but also because of the very many intelligence agencies who said, hey, he stole from us too. And you don't want to go up against the intelligence agencies. I think what we're seeing all around us is Trump trying to delay all the cases so that they happen after the election with the expectation that one way or another he is going to be in office, and then first of all he's going to make him go away. He's going to appoint an attorney general and a Justice Department that gets rid of all those cases and instead prosecutes Democrats. And he has already said repeatedly, what was good for me is what was good for them is going to be good for me. I'm going to go after them. The difference, of course, is that he appears to have committed crimes, and juries, grand juries, not the Justice Department, but grand juries of his peers are the ones who say that he has committed crimes. I don't think you're going to get that with the kind of things that they want to launch against, for example, Joe Biden, whom they are investigating now for a possible impeachment, and Alejandro Mayorkas, the Homeland Security Secretary, who is, they've already written the articles of impeachment, even though they haven't really had hearings yet, because they're so determined to make, have another investigation. Remember that investigations are the bread and butter of the Republican Party because they seed in people's minds the idea that something bad has happened there, the same way, for example, that you're thinking about Fani Willis, who, they threw crap at the wall, and enough people said, oh my God, there's crap on the wall, that now things are slowing down over there, and you're seeing all these articles about how this is going to hurt the case. And that's what they do. They're playing public opinion. So can he be found guilty after he's elected? One, that simply wouldn't happen. But two, remember, first of all, we haven't tried it. But second of all, during the Watergate crisis, the Department of Justice had a memo, it's never been tried in court or anything, saying that you couldn't try or you couldn't indict a president while in office, because it was, or there were limits to what you could do to a president in office because it would take too much time. Defending him would take too much of his time to run the country at the same time. So I think if he's reelected, these all go away, is the bottom line. All right. So a couple of questions here. So Peter Adams has said it would be great to have a top 10 list of things from Biden. I think somebody's working on that. I think she might be here right now. If she's not, I hope her ears just perked up. And second of all, another question you asked, where's my other list here? I don't remember what I was going to say. All right, so that was what you asked about. Oh, no, the other thing you asked about was the economy. You keep hearing the Republicans out there saying, well, they want to go back to Trump because the economy was so much better under Trump. And someone said, is that true? And the answer is no. I don't use a lot of profanity on these chats, but I have to say that falls under the category of BS, right? Trump kept bragging that he would get U.S. growth up to 3%. In the first 3 years of his presidency, and my statistics about this, by the way, come from the Wall Street Journal, which is no hotbed of leftiness, right? In the first 3 years of his presidency, before the pandemic hit, because of course the pandemic just tanked everything, the annual growth in the United States was 2.5%. It's fine, it's fine. But under Biden, in the last quarter of 2023, it was 4.9%. Now, there's been a huge, obviously, you can't really do the same sort of comparison because he came in with the pandemic, where everything had crashed and all that. So it's a little harder to do an apples to apples comparison, but there's no doubt that the Biden policies of investing in the middle class and workers have dramatically increased growth. So Biden has brought manufacturing back to the United States. He has poured a ton of money into infrastructure, not only roads and bridges, but also into building chips plants and investing in science, with the idea of bringing home our supply chains, which is one of the reasons that Mexico has just overtaken China as our largest trading partner, is because of the attempt to put so many more factories in Mexico and having supply chains go that way. During the Biden administration, we had bad inflation, right, which was kind of to be expected, not only because of the supply chains and all the money in the economy when people hadn't been able to spend it during the pandemic, but also because of what's known as greedflation. That is, a number of companies really hiked their prices and then never brought them back down, and there's been a lot in the news about that lately. So you could expect that, but one of the statistics that has come out is how much faster actual wages have grown than the inflation. So lots of people have made a lot of money. The difference is there are people at the bottom of the economic scale instead of the people at the top, for a change. So the idea that things are better under Trump is just wrong. And he said things like, well, if you look at how much money that the farmers have made under me, and I put these tariffs on China and you got all this money. Well, that's true, but they got that money because there was such a hit to our soybean industry, for example, with those tariffs, that the government basically just paid the farmers off, and that was tax money that went to them. It was not some great brilliant thing that Trump had done. So what Biden has done is he has taken a look at the whole economic system and said, hey, let's rebuild the things that we had before the Republicans took over in 1981 and killed it all. And really try to invest in our manufacturing and in our in our roads and in all the things that really helped our economy to grow before the Republicans said, no, we want to put all the money at the top and they will invest in stuff. And one of the things I think I said on something the other day, I kept writing about this and saying, hey, it's working, and I kept reading in the papers, we're all going to hell in a handbasket. And finally there was one night where I sat there and thought, have I just drunk the Kool-Aid? I mean, is it really going to be bad and I'm just not seeing it? And then it hit me that of course it was going to be fine because we've done it before. We know how it turns out. And that's the piece that really kind of woke me up to the idea that it's not that Biden is out doing something totally brand new, although there are new aspects of it, so much as the fact that he is really resurrecting a much fairer economy that we had before 1981, and we know how it plays out. So it's not like where he's flying by the seat of his pants. He's really trying to break up monopolies, which is one thing that his Commerce Department has done under Lena Khan. He's trying to invest in ordinary people. He's trying to bring supply chains home. It's basically dialing the clock back to what it was before the Republicans, that old guard Republicans, took over. All right, so I wanted to go in a direction that you did not ask about, simply because I'm a little surprised that nobody is talking about it, and I'm fascinated by it. So, as you probably know, and some of the people may actually be listening here, I'm an Americanist. And I didn't really know a lot about 20th century foreign affairs. I'm actually very good on foreign affairs through World War I. But then it gets really complicated. And I was a 19th century scholar, so I didn't pay a lot of attention to it. And of course, the thing that got me really involved in writing the letters from an American was the everything going on in Ukraine, and Trump trying to extort Volodymyr Zelensky and all that, and I started trying to figure that out. And a now dear friend of mine who is Ukrainian and knows her history incredibly well and all that really started coaching me through many bigger issues in foreign affairs. And I got really, I think the word obsessed is not unfair with American foreign affairs. And I thought, why don't we talk about that more? Like, until 1947, that's the point I look at it, when we get the National Security Act that really centers foreign policy in the White House, people talked about foreign affairs all the time. And now when we talk about foreign affairs, no one really seems to understand what's going on. They just sort of have a knee-jerk reaction that always seems to me sort of to be rooted in our experience in Vietnam, even if what's going on doesn't have anything to do with Vietnam. So in this moment where we are now, I'm going to start focusing a lot more on foreign affairs, in part because it's so important to us right now as Americans, but also because it's really interesting. Because if Biden has been transformative in the US, he has also been transformative overseas. And so one of the places I want to start here is with Ukraine. What Ukraine is doing in holding off Vladimir Putin's Russia is trying to protect, obviously, itself, and I don't mean to denigrate that, but trying to protect Europe and trying to protect NATO and the pieces of a global order based in rules rather than in one big country being able to take everything over, that the United States and other countries put together after World War II to try and stop another world war. So, of course, pushing against that are people like Vladimir Putin and Viktor Orban in Hungary, and perhaps to some degree Xi Jinping in China, people who are interested in getting rid of that rules-based order a little bit. I don't want to say that for Xi, who actually needs it for a lot of things. But certainly Putin does not want to have a rules-based order. He wants to be able to take over Ukraine. He wants to be able to take over different countries because that will enable him to have more resources, more people, and become more powerful. And so one of the things to be watching right now is the fact that anybody who really understands our national security recognizes that investing in Ukraine's attempt to protect itself is actually good for the American economy, because what we're doing is we're shipping them our old weaponry and rebuilding stuff for ourselves. But it's also good for the world, because it's going to help us protect a rules-based order, the UN, all the different ways, NATO, CETO, all the different ways in which the world is knit together, so that you can't just get a dictator coming in and saying, I'm going to take everything over. The fact that the radical right in the United States is blocking aid to Ukraine is hugely problematic. It's problematic for Ukraine. It's problematic for the world. It is also hugely problematic for our national security. And they know that. And that makes me wonder a lot what they're up to. And this is one of the reasons that you're seeing Biden, for example, and the Democrats, and also a number of Republicans saying, come on, guys, why are we not supporting Ukraine? Because Ukraine needs support right now. And interestingly enough, other countries are jumping in to help. And they're, but there's no doubt we're the big dog in the fight, and we need to be doing that. So that's one thing to keep your eye on. The other thing that it surprises me that we are not seeing in our papers much is what's happening in the Middle East. Because if you remember when Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, there's been a lot of moving pieces since then. And what it's worth remembering here, first of all, is that the first thing that Biden and Secretary of State Antony Blinken did, and this is like public, you can find this in all of their speeches, is they said, this must not spread across the Middle East. This must stay contained. So the U.S. moved a couple of carrier groups, which are not just carrier ships. There are also helicopters and troops and submarines into the region. They kept saying, we're going to stand behind Israel. Do not escalate, that's the wrong word. Do not spread this war. So if you think about that is an umbrella over everything, and you hear a lot again in our papers, well, Biden is funding attacks on Gaza. That idea of protecting Israel, which is an ally, to make sure that it keeps a lid on attacks on Israel from Hamas, the Houthis from Yemen, and especially Hezbollah in Lebanon, is a way to try and keep that from escalating. And they're very clear about this. Now, this also explains the attacks on the Houthis in Yemen, who are trying desperately to destabilize that roof over everything. And it's worth remembering, when you think about those things, that those groups I just mentioned, Hamas, the Houthis, and Hezbollah, those are non-state actors. They are not the states under which they exist. The states in the Middle East, the Arab states, have not signed on to that war. They have not stood behind Hamas. They have not stood behind Hezbollah and the Houthis, because they don't want the whole place to explode either. So if you think about that larger Middle East, and Biden saying, don't start this fight. Now, the other thing you see in the news all the time is Biden is just supporting everything Netanyahu does. That is absolutely not true. From the very beginning, the Biden administration has really put pressure on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu not to attack Gaza to the degree he wanted. So if you remember early on, Biden exchanged a visit to the area for an opening of of relief going into Gaza. He has tried desperately to try and keep the Israelis under Netanyahu from expanding that war. So we know now that Netanyahu wanted to attack Hezbollah, and part of his war cabinet and the Americans said, don't you dare do it. That's gonna increase the war the way we don't want it to increase. So there is this attempt to stabilize that situation and to keep a lid on Netanyahu. And you can now see that splitting apart, with Netanyahu saying, we're going to do what we want over here, because he's got his own problem, much like Donald Trump's. He's in trouble with his legal issues, and he's trying to keep his coalition behind him, which is a far-right coalition, even though his approval ratings are absolutely in the toilet. So the whole reason I gave you this whole thing is that since the very beginning, and this is interesting because you keep reading in the papers, people saying, oh, Biden's changing his tune. And I'm like, nah, he's been saying it all along, actually. Since the very beginning, Netanyahu's power in Israel was based on the idea that he could keep Israel safe. October 7th blew that up. He couldn't do that. His approval rating is dropped. He is much weaker than he was in the past. And since the very beginning, the Americans were talking about a two-state solution, resurrecting the two-state solution. Gradually, more and more people have been talking about creating a Palestinian state. And if you remember, the Israelis came out under Netanyahu and said, not happening, we need to control all this, and we're going to take over Gaza. And Netanyahu was forced to walk that back after a conversation with the Americans. And increasingly, you're hearing, everybody kept talking about a ceasefire, and Israel said, we're not going to leave Hamas in power. And the Americans backed that idea. But people haven't switched over to the idea that a two-state solution is increasingly talked about and increasingly within the imagination of people. And that's something I think to be watching for going forward, because it is part of what's happening in the Middle East, is part of, I think, a much larger transformation that the Biden administration is trying to put in place. And I'm very much an agnostic on this, I have to say, but it is fascinating. And that's that the old post-war idea of the world that was basically divided in two, and there was going to be this idea that there was this democracies pushing back against the communism. That's gone. So what's going to replace it? And as soon as Blinken took office, he and Biden gave a speech at the State Department on February 4th, in 2021, in which he said diplomacy is back on the table. And what they, I think, are constructing is the idea of diplomacy that brings together countries in areas to solve their own issues without it being one big dog against another big dog. And you can see this, I think, in immigration, where they're trying to do that. You can see it for sure in Africa, where the Biden administration has worked very hard to make sure that the African Union got a seat on the G20. I think it's now the G21. And you can see it of course, in the Indo-Pacific in a huge way, where the administration has really supported Vietnam, for example, and the Pacific Islands, and letting people have much more access to resources so they can take a bigger seat at the table. But I think you're also seeing it in the Middle East. And it's really interesting to see whether or not that could work. Because if it did, and if in fact the Arab states poured the kind of money into that Palestinian state that they have said they will do, if Hamas is not in control and if there is a viable Palestinian Authority, it's a game changer. And it's the reason I mention it here is because there are many moving pieces, and I don't think they're getting represented in the United States press. And I think you kind of have to understand them to face our upcoming election, because if you just look at what you're hearing and not seeing the bigger picture, it I think misrepresents what's actually happening there. All right, so let me leave you with a word of hope, if that wasn't enough hope, and it wasn't. Remember that the only way that the radical right can take power in the United States is for them to be able to do what they are trying to do, which is to convince the rest of us that they are already in power, that our voices don't matter. So now is your time. Take up oxygen. Find a friend. Don't do it alone unless you're one of those people who feels comfortable doing that. Find a friend. Volunteer to be election workers. Get out the vote. Talk to your friends. We'll maybe have some more ideas on this site sooner rather than later. But remember that there's never a reactionary right movement that ever gets more than about 33% of the population at the top. But they get the rest to go along through intimidation, through fear, through apathy, through the idea that they can't make a difference. So don't be that way. We have, 10 months left to go? And there's a lot of work to be done, but it's also creative and it's fun. And if you get overwhelmed, don't get involved. Take a break from it. I got to say, I wrote by accident last night, because I thought, I just don't care. I don't want to do any more of this stupid political stuff, which is why I ended up writing so much about Mexico. But you're allowed to take a break. But when you feel like you can get engaged, do, because this is our moment. The same way that the 1850s were a moment for Lincoln's people, and the same way that the 1890s and the 1900s were Teddy Roosevelt's people, and the same way that the 30s and the 40s were FDR's people. So now's our time, and I have every confidence that we can do it. All right, thank you for being here, and I will try and do these as much as possible, but I'm going to see a lot of you on the road for the next several months. Thanks for being here. A lot going on, but I think maybe I can put a little bit of a bow around it. If we start with President Trump's 18-minute speech of last night, which was not very useful if you were actually trying to learn anything actually going on in the United States right now, but I thought it was actually really an illuminating speech. Not because, as I say, of the information in it, most of which was false, but the fact that it seemed in many ways to be a representation not only of Trump's presidency, but also of about 45 years of an era in American history. All right, so what am I talking about when I say that? So remember that Trump really came into his own as, what one sort of puff piece called the King of New York in the 1980s. That was really his decade. And the 1980s were characterized by the rise of Reagan republicanism, and that was based in the idea that the modern government that had regulated business and provided a basic social safety net and promoted infrastructure and protected civil rights and underlined and underpinned rules-based international order was, in fact, not a good thing for the United States of America, that it was, in their words, socialism, because those social welfare programs that helped the people in the United States, everybody in the United States, but especially those who had historically been shut out of economic prosperity and of the ability to get education and healthcare and so on, tended to be people of color and women. And so what those who were trying to get rid of the government that we had between 1933 and 1981 did is they said that those social welfare programs were a form of socialism because they required tax dollars to come from people who had money and income and be used in such a way that they benefited everybody. And therefore, that was a redistribution of tax dollars, which they said was a form of socialism. And they harnessed both racism and sexism to that by saying, it's basically, white tax dollars that are going to people of color, Black Americans, women who want equality and so on. And by the 2020s, 2012, for example, when Mitt Romney was running for president as a Republican, you remember people talking about the makers and the takers. You can see how this ideology really ran a lot of the ideology of that 40-year period, especially on the Republican side, although there were a number of times when the Democrats were sort of Republican light on that one. And that's the way you get these sort of errors in American history is an interesting one. But right now I'm going to focus primarily on Trump and where he was coming from. So the trick, though, is that with the idea that you were going to cut taxes and cut regulation, the idea was that those cuts would concentrate wealth among investors who would in turn plow it back into the economy in such a way that we'd have extraordinary economic growth that would help everybody. And with that economic growth, lower taxes would continue to produce more revenue than in the previous period when you had more regulation and higher taxation. And so we'd be able to have the kinds of social safety programs that we needed without actually having taxation. And if you remember, and I'm sure most of you don't because I'm on the older end now, but if you remember George H.W. Bush referring to this concept of the economy as voodoo economics, that's because a lot of people didn't think this was going to work, that if you cut taxes and you cut regulations, that in fact what you would do is take an express train back to that period before 1933, when you had exactly that form of economic policy in the country. And what it had done is it had concentrated a ton of wealth upward, really hurt the people who needed to be able to buy things, for example, to keep a consumer economy going, ended up hurting workers very badly and ultimately resulted in the Great Crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed it. So a lot of people were really skeptical about this, but for a number of reasons I can't give you all of 20th century history here in a half an hour, so I'll skip forward. But for a lot of reasons that is the system that went into place. But here's the kicker, and to go back to Trump's speech of last night, it never worked. That idea that if you cut taxes and you cut regulation and the money that was freed up would get plowed back into the economy in such a way that workers' wages would go up and we'd get more tax dollars simply didn't work. What we have done since that period is to drive our national debt through the roof, primarily not through Reagan's tax cuts, but through the Trump tax cuts of 2017, and now the ones that will continue in place after January 1st of 2026, and by the tax cuts from George W. Bush. If you remember, under Bill Clinton in the early 1990s, Democratic President Bill Clinton, thanks to some of the measures that both he put in place and that George H.W. Bush put in place, we actually had a balanced budget. Okay, we actually had a balanced budget. And the first thing that George W. Bush did when he got into office was to blow that up with more tax cuts, quite deliberately, with the idea that so long as there was money coming in, that people, the Democrats, would want to have a social safety net. And there was a real desire on the part of a number of increasingly right-wing Republicans to get rid of that government that first Franklin Delano Roosevelt had put into place in the 1930s, and then Truman and Eisenhower and so on, right up through Ronald Reagan, had continued to support. So they worked to blow that up, to get rid of that money, and to say, now you gotta cut more programs because we don't have the money to pay for them. All right, but the trick here was that this never worked. The system never worked, and I think you can see some of that. Well, let me actually finish with what that argument was. The argument continued on to say that those people who wanted a social safety net, for example, and wanted infrastructure, wanted education, wanted healthcare, and so on, those people were the takers, as I said, and they were overwhelmingly in this vision, people of color, Black Americans, and women. And increasingly over that 40 to 45 year period, those people got defined as being other, as being unwelcome in American society, as being the takers that I just talked about, and increasingly were denigrated as people who should not have the ability to govern. And you can see this in the increasing discussion of Democrats throughout this period as being un-American, as being as winning elections only by cheating, and so on. So you have this idea that the Democrats can only win through getting these people to vote for them, and that if the Democrats do get in power, they're going to turn into socialists. They're going to turn the American government into socialism, and that if you get rid of that system and put in place that Republican system, everybody's going to have this wonderful economic experience. Okay, if that's the worldview we're talking about here, a worldview that it certainly seems like Donald Trump absorbed in the 1980s and came to believe, the idea in it being that certain people, especially certain white men, were better than women and people of color and Black Americans, and they had a right to rule the country, maybe a duty to rule the country. Something you saw, by the way, in the Vanity Fair article by Chris Whipple that came out Tuesday, that in which White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles actually says, Trump has said to me a million times, I judge people by their genes. Genes, by the way, not blue jeans. That idea that some people are just genetically better than others. So what you see, if you put all those things together, I think what you saw in that speech of last night, first of all, was an incredibly angry man and an incredibly frightened man. And I probably won't have time to pursue the other obvious thing there, and that's a man who is mentally almost incapacitated. So you had all those things going on, but why? Why did that speech seem to me to be significant when it was really just an old man screaming at us, right? Think of what he emphasized. It was supposed to be a speech about the economy. And he did talk a little bit about the economy. And by the way, you can get transcripts of a number of those speeches. The big speeches, just Google Trump speech transcript. The New York Times has one today, but many, many people do, which I find a much easier way to digest him, not least because I read a lot faster than you can watch something. He did talk about the economy, but everything he said about it was a lie. It was a fantasy. The economy is not great. The economy was, he said he inherited a disaster. He didn't inherit a disaster. He inherited an economy that The Economist, which is a center-right publication about the economy, called the envy of the world. The Biden economy was the envy of the world. Now, it did, of course, have the terrible inflation in the immediate months after the pandemic shut everything down because of supply chain issues, because of pent-up demand, because of pent-up, people had money. That certainly was part of it. But by the time Trump took office, that economy was booming. All he had to do was go on the golf course and drink Diet Cokes, and let the Biden economy play itself out, and he would now be sitting pretty and he could have claimed it all. And quite frankly, that's what people like me thought he would do. Which worried me because I thought it would make people think that the economy that he was rhetorically embracing worked. Instead, no, he believed that tearing apart the kind of economy that Biden was trying to put into place, and I'll tell you more about that in a second, was the right thing to do, and that what he needed to do was to do what the Republicans had said they wanted to do since the 1980s, but never had done. And I'll get to why they had never done it. And that is to get rid of that modern government, the government that is our EPA, the government that is, the atmospheric organization or agency that the Trump administration announced yesterday it's going to get rid of, the government that is Social Security, that is Medicaid, that is SNAP, that is all those programs that we have had for almost 100 years now that support a social safety net and that have made the United States the strongest nation and the wealthiest nation on earth. Trump set out to tear all that apart. You remember he talked about tariffs and how tariffs were going to make us incredibly strong again. And everybody, every modern economist, and certainly every historian was like, dude, we got rid of that system after they tried to put it in place again during the Depression, and the tariffs of that era completely destroyed the world economy. That's not how the economy works. That's, it maybe worked in the 1890s to benefit the very wealthy industrialists, an era to which he looks back very fondly. But it screwed over the American people, and the system doesn't work anymore. Well, he didn't care. He's put that in place again. And we're seeing inflation, we're seeing job loss, we're seeing all kinds of ways in which the economy is increasingly getting shaky. But that's not what he said. He said last night, the economy's never been better. I've created this booming economy. It is simply not true. And you can see the number of places in which he tried to shore that up, most notably in this argument that he is going to fund these additional checks of $1,776 for military personnel that he suggested was based in money that's coming in from his tariffs. Remember, money from tariffs comes from the American people. It is not paid by people overseas. This is money that comes from the American people, first of all. But second of all, that's not where that money is coming from. The news has been very, very clear about this today. That's actually money that Congress, in a bipartisan way, appropriated for housing allowances for military personnel, that he's simply going to rebrand and say, oh yeah, I'm going to put my name on it, and this is going to be a sign of how great my economy is. And that strikes me as being sort of this moment where somebody once described Trump, and I'm sorry to say I don't remember who it was, and I wish I did, but as if your grandfather watching the Fox News channel suddenly became president because he believes all that rhetoric. Now, Republican leaders actually spouted that rhetoric, but they never put it in place fully. They made sure that there was enough of a social safety net in place that they could still get people to turn out and vote for them by dividing them along class lines and by racial lines and by gender lines. That is, you don't want to be one of those people, vote for us. But Trump didn't understand that. And what he and Russell Vought, the Office of Management and Budget, and what other members of administration have done, including Elon Musk at the Department of Government Efficiency, what they did is they have stripped away that social safety net that we all rely on and that Trump voters too expected would stay into place. So now he's facing this extraordinary revolt on the part even of his own voters saying, what'd you just do to the economy, dude? And I will get to more about that in just a minute. But I want to finish with a speech first. So you saw that, but then you also saw, both in Trump and in something that the Republicans did yesterday in Congress, and that the Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. did today, you saw a real doubling down on the racism and not so much the sexism in that speech last night as attacks on trans people. really very deliberately Trump going after people who can't fight back, who are a small minority and already very vulnerable in our society, which again is part of this formula. Go after those people. So you asked me to talk about the bill to protect children's innocence, the House passed yesterday. And I think it's worth looking at that as a messaging bill from the radical people, the radical MAGAs in the House of Representatives. What it does is it criminalizes the doctors treating transgender children under the age of 18. There's some carve-outs, but what it really does is it targets people to try and get votes, to try and say, well, those people are different, those people are dangerous, and I'm going to protect, I'm going to protect the children, which again is a really ironic title right now when we are seeing more and more from the files from the Epstein estate. We still have not seen anything from the FBI investigation of Epstein. All of that is legally supposed to come out tomorrow, although that's the final date for it. And I am 100% expecting fireworks over that. 100% expecting fireworks. So you could see that in Trump's attacks on Somali immigrants in Minnesota. And also on his, he said, Democrats are trying to force through transgender for everyone. No, what Democrats and people who are protecting the transgender community are doing is they are trying to reinforce two things. One, the idea that we are all equal before the law. And when you start to carve out one group or another, it's only a question of time until people come for you. And the fact that the government is not supposed to intrude on our private decisions. And, what you discuss with your doctor is nobody else's business. And this, I hope I have time to tell you about the 1920s, because, and in case I don't go for it, one of the things that I get time for it, one of the things that I've been looking at a lot lately, for other reasons, I'm working on a book, is the Buck v. Bell decision of 1927. And if you think that the government should be able to make your medical decisions or make other people's medical decisions, look at Buck v. Bell, because that's the one in which the Supreme Court says it's okay for Virginia and other states to sterilize people that they consider undesirable, so long as they have a hearing about why that person is undesirable beforehand. And that the sterilization of Americans lasted, that's 1927, lasted, and I hope you're sitting down, until the 1970s. 1970s, it was still policy to sterilize certain indigenous women in American society. So that attack on transgender people, on Somalis, that's again part of that. Those people are other. You need to vote for me. You need to keep behind me. And the other piece of that was, I think, let's see, what else did I have here? The other piece of that is his insistence, yet again, that he won the 2020 election, which is just simply false. He's got nothing at all, except that he keeps screaming it. But that again speaks back to that idea that only Republicans can legitimately win an election. That despite the fact that President Joe Biden got more votes and so on and so forth, no, that was illegitimate. And that is part of that whole formula. So to have him screaming at us like that, those things that were false and that were so indicative of what was a wink and a nod and a dog whistle, when, except for people who were really watching, historians were real skeptical of Ronald Reagan, and so were a number of journalists, by the way. But he was genteel and he was quiet, and he sort of put a gloss on that rhetoric. It felt to me like what we saw last night was the degeneration of that rhetoric into an old man with seemingly mental health issues screaming at us that we had to believe this. We had to turn against our neighbors. We had to believe that the economy was good when it is demonstrably not. We had to believe that Democrats couldn't win an election legitimately, that only he could. And it just really hit me. That speech really hit me. Again, not because of anything in it that was legit, that was like a legitimate fact, but because it almost was like watching something crumble, which of course is what my career has been about, is watching this ideology rise and then fall. And so, when all you got's a hammer, everything's a nail, right? So maybe I'm just the only one who looked at it that way, but it just felt like a fitting epitaph to have this man screaming at us something that was demonstrably untrue, like, believe it, you piggies, or whatever he would have screamed at somebody like me. So that, I think, is why that was significant. But now let's go another step beyond that, because one of the things that he is clearly trying to do is to rewrite the history of that last really 80-year period, and to take us back to the 1920s as if that was this great moment when we had quotas for making sure we only got immigrants from certain countries, when we had Buck v. Bell, when we had the Republicans in charge of a system that cut regulations and taxation that had been part of our society since the Progressive Era and World War I, getting rid of all of those things. And you can see him trying to rewrite history in such a heavy-handed way that it is. I worry a lot less that it's going to stick than when people rewrite history subtly. And what I mean by that is, first of all, you can't have missed the degree to which he is literally trying to rewrite the landscape of Washington, D.C. He literally bulldozed the East Wing of the White House, which I still can't wrap my head around. And I have written about, if you haven't read about it, I've written about the fact that the administration is now arguing in court that it is a national security issue to have to continue to build what Trump wants in place of what he knocked down. Because in the process of knocking down the East Wing, they also made it impossible to use the security center that was housed underneath the East Wing, one of the reasons the East Wing was built. And they have to build it as quickly as possible to get that security system back, because without that, the Secret Service is arguing they can't adequately protect the president, which I have to say sounds a little bit like that old saw about somebody murdering their parents and then throwing themselves on the mercy of the court because they're an orphan, right? If he didn't want to destroy that, he shouldn't have knocked it down. But he's trying literally to impose what he wants on the White House without any of the usual reviews, without any input either from the historic organization that was charged by Congress to do that, or by the American people, who by law also have a say in it, and so on. So you see it there, but you also see it in the apparent attempt to knock down 4 historic buildings, including the Cohen Building, which has those magnificent Ben Shahn murals I've written about a couple times. Other people have written about it even more than I have, and much more in much more depth, and done a much better job of it than I did. But in an attempt to get rid of the Liberty Loan Building and all these spaces there, as well as to put up a triumphal arch in between the Lincoln Memorial and the Arlington Cemetery, which is it hits very hard, because the whole reason those are set up the way they are is because the Arlington National Cemetery is on what was the plantation of Robert E. Lee, and who was one of the chief generals for the Confederacy in the Civil War. And so the Union buried their dead on his property quite deliberately to say, this is your fault. And then they built the Lincoln Memorial where they did, to honor him to sort of overshadow Lee's plantation. So the idea that Trump's going to throw an arch there is it means a lot to people who care about the war. But in addition to really trying to literally landscape the capital, which I continue to maintain is in part because that's where he feels comfortable, is doing real estate stuff, and because his mind is slipping, that's where his handlers keep pushing him. Here, go work a little bit on your Rose Garden Club or your whatever. But he's of course also trying to rewrite history, literally to rewrite history, to get rid of the women and people of color and Black Americans who have shaped American history, and I would argue who are central to American history, because if you really think about what it means to be an American and what the centerpiece of American history is, it is the struggle of ordinary Americans to expand our democracy when faced with obstacles. And who does that better than anybody else? People of color, Black people, women, people who've been excluded from that concept of human self-determination. So by erasing all of those people, he's sort of erasing American history and centering it around people for whom that isn't a reality. They had those things. But he's trying to do it quite literally now in those stupid plaques he has put in the White House. And that is, I think, symbolic not only of his attempt to rewrite history. In those plaques, denigrate Democratic presidents and lionize Republican presidents, including himself, and he's got portraits of himself absolutely everywhere. What that really does, though, is it emphasizes the degree to which he doesn't really take seriously the institution of the American presidency. But he also is really, in many ways, as I say, bringing to life the 1920s again, because by getting rid of a system that we have had in place since the 1930s, that system of checks and balances and so on, what he's done is he's really opened up the way for extraordinary corruption. And he's opened up the way for there to be a sort of one-man rule. And by the corruption, I mean not only the fact that people in his circle are walking away with a lot of money, but also with things like the announcement yesterday, two announcements yesterday. One, that the government would be closing the National, and I'm not going to get the name right, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, NCAR, National Center for Academic Research. Atmospheric research in Colorado. And it was pretty clear that they are doing that because Trump's mad at the governor of Colorado, Jared Polis, who has said he won't pardon Tina Peters, who was the election official in Colorado who breached the databases in order to try to make Trump president in 2020. Trump offered her a full pardon, but because he's a president, that doesn't do you much good for a state crime. In fact, does you no good. So he's trying to pressure Polis to go ahead and pardon her, or he's going to take away one of the crown jewels of our earth sciences apparatus in the United States, infrastructure in the United States. Similarly, yesterday, you saw dramatic cuts to the American Academy of Pediatrics. And there too, I mean, what good does it do to cut grants for pediatricians, the people who do pediatrics? Well, it's worth knowing that the American Academy of Pediatrics has stood up very strongly against the Trump administration's attacks on vaccinations, for example, and again, it's other attacks on healthcare in the United States. So this is a way to concentrate power among that very small group of people who are around Trump. So I think you're seeing here the destruction of American democracy is the goal. But what I think you're also seeing is the end of this era and its descent into one-person rule and the corruption of the extraordinary wealth of the United States and power of the United States going to a handful of Trump's advisors. And I think one of the things the interview with Susie Wiles showed us is that not one of them has an idea of the public good. Not one of them has an idea, even that what they are doing is good for the American people, except perhaps to the degree that somebody like J.D. Vance, the vice president, wants to impose theocratic rule on the rest of us because at some level he thinks that's good for us. But it just feels very much like every person in that White House is out to get whatever they can from this moment and from this president. And that is, I don't know, it just really felt like an epitaph to me last night. And I'm not saying we're done. I mean, I actually think the next several months are going to be a dumpster fire. I do know that, a lot of people have been writing to me and saying, why didn't you cover this in your letter? Why didn't you cover that in your letter? And there are two reasons for that. One is that my letters are already too long. I know they're too long. You know they're too long. They take way too long to write. I mean, literally, I'm doing nothing these days but getting up, writing until I go to bed. But also because it's just too much coming at us all the time. I mean, there's just, it's, I'm not crying uncle yet, but there is some point at which it just keeps coming over the transom, and you're like, wait a minute, I've already got 15 things to write about tonight. I can't write about 5 more. And so I don't mean to suggest that it's over by any stretch of the imagination. But there's nothing new there. There's nothing exciting there. There's nothing but hatred and corruption and how much you can get out of things. And unless you're a member of that inner circle, you're not going to get anything. So it's a little hard to see that being an ideology, which is what I study, an ideology that is going to carry successfully forward. What you can see happening is it transforming into an ideology of pure fascism, the idea that a few people should run everything and that they're going to take over the businesses, as Trump, as you know, is doing, and use the military against the American people. That's an ideological direction they could go. But one of the things that I also think we are seeing is increasing momentum against that idea, against the idea of what you saw screaming at us last night from the White House. And that people have also asked me to talk about, and I will briefly here. One of the things that you see, I think you see emerging, is the recognition, finally, among a number of people who rhetorically thought they hated the idea of the liberal consensus, which is this government that regulates business and provides a basic social safety net and promotes infrastructure and protects civil rights and stabilizes the world. Rhetorically, they could say, I hate the deep state, or, I don't like the what Rush Limbaugh called the feminazis or whatever. But they're starting to see that, in fact, they're the ones who are benefiting from that government, actually more than the people that they were attacking. And you're seeing their increasingly to be public support for a number of things that don't simply reflect the world that we had before 2021. And what I mean by that is that the New Deal government that FDR put in place and that Truman and Eisenhower and so on supported really emphasized the idea of protecting a male, usually white, but male anyway, breadwinner. The world, in their view, was centered around that guy who took care of his family. But that was actually never really the way society worked, ever. I mean, it's a vision of a heteronormative nuclear family that becomes very powerful in popular culture after World War II. But the world never really worked that way. And for some of you, if you think about it, you know that. Certainly growing up in a rural area, grandma lived with you sometimes, or sometimes people couldn't go home at night, so they stayed at your house. And, there was a lot, there were a lot of, single sex couples, I have a great story, but of a name that one woman I can say it this way. I don't want to give you the actual name, but there was a woman I grew up with who always she lived with her friend for 1,000,000 years, because they were like 600,000 years old, right? When I was a little girl. But she always introduced herself as Miss by Choice, and then she would say her name, to the point that I was probably in my 30s before I realized her middle name was not by choice. She was Miss by Choice, and then her name. So we've always had these different family relationships. That's always been the case in at least in the United States. But so one of the things that I think you are seeing perhaps now is the emergence of a recognition of that. And what I mean by that is somebody asked me to talk about what has happened with the discharge petition for the Affordable Care Act premium tax credits that the Republicans cut in their budget reconciliation bill of July, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And what has happened to that? What happened was that the Democrats have fought very, very hard for continuing those subsidies. And the Republicans have been unwilling to do so because that's a continuation of that government that I'm saying they're trying to get rid of. But there's such a recognition among the American people that we must have some kind of health care. And by the way, that was the Republican concept of health care that went into place, not the Democratic one. That was all that the Obama Democrats could get through Congress. So the reason that the Republicans can't come up with a different system is because that was their system. The other one is the idea of universal health care, which is, what other countries have. But right now about between 75 and 80% of Americans want those credits extended. They affect about 24 million Americans, and their healthcare premiums are already skyrocketing. So, and a lot of people will have to stop insuring because of how expensive it's going to be. So you're starting to see not only among Democrats and independents, both of whom have been pushing for this, but also among Republicans, a recognition that healthcare matters to people and that healthcare is something that a modern government should provide. But there's other stuff that's coming out too. So obviously you're seeing support for education. But one of the words that I've been watching is the word child care. Now, if you remember, the Biden administration tried to put in place two kinds of infrastructure bills, and one of them was for child care, elder care, education, and that's sort of what I would call soft infrastructure, and that never made it anywhere. But I mean, it made it some places, but it obviously didn't pass. But you're increasingly seeing people talk about childcare. You're increasingly seeing people talk about creating a social safety net that does not center around a male breadwinner, but that centers rather around children. And that strikes me as being really, really interesting in terms of an ideological development and who's going to pick that up. So, one of the things you're seeing a lot is a lot of complaints about the Democratic Party. And there's this big thing out today about, the autopsy for 2024 and, people are mad because the Democrats won't share it and so on and so forth. And I'm sort of the thought, like, I don't really care. I hate to say that, but, it's kind of for me like doing an autopsy of the Whigs in 1856 in that by then, the mood of the country had changed so that a lot of the ideas of the Whig Party moved into the Republican Party. But there were so many new ideas, it didn't really make sense to focus on something that was already in the rearview mirror. So in this moment, it just feels like we're seeing a lot of political transformation. You're seeing the standard bearer for the right wing melt down in front of us. You're seeing people trying to grab as much power as they possibly can under that standard bearer. But then you're also seeing extraordinary amounts of pushback, more and more amounts of pushback, where, for example, the New York City Bar today came out and listed all the ways in which they think that Donald Trump has broken the law. So, I got nothing really for you today except the recognition that, let me see if I covered everything. It's always kind of a game to see if I can get to everything you asked me about. The one thing I didn't talk about was the administration's threats to strip citizenship from naturalized Americans. That's part, I think, of that attack on the other, on immigrants as being something different than native-born Americans. It is possible to strip citizenship from people, but I think the average number of people from whom citizenship was stripped in the past was 9 people a year, and that is because they had histories of criminal activity or something major in their past that they did not share with immigration authorities. So this is new, and we'll see where it goes in the courts. But anyway, I hope that covers enough stuff. it just feels like we're in an incredibly unsettled time. But once again, I would urge you to make your voices heard now, to support those candidates that talk about stuff you care about. Is your person going to be the great hope of the liberal, small L liberal future? Who knows? But their ideas matter. And sometimes some of the weakest vessels are the ones who articulate ideas that stronger vessels pick up later on. So now is the time for people to make what they want heard, and to recognize that the momentum in this country right now is not on the side of Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans, just the opposite. Their numbers are dropping. Susie Wiles's interview showed a group of people who were entirely out for themselves and looked rather like a dysfunctional family, and that in which people like her were trying to make sure they were not the ones holding the bag if push came to shove and the law got involved. So you've got that on one side, and on the other side, you're having more and more voices coming out and saying, hey, wait a minute, we need to protect our immigrant neighbors. We need to protect our transgender friends. We need to make sure people are treated equally before the law. We need to protect our health care. We need to protect our education. We need to protect the climate. We need to enter the 21st century in such a way that we create a better life, not just a standard of living, although that's crucial, but a better life that enables more people to become the best that they can be and what they want to be going forward into the 21st century. I feel like I'm usually more cheerful than I am today, but I confess I'm tired. Lots been happening, and I just hope we all keep the faith and keep on moving and keep swinging, even when you get exhausted, because we're in it. This is our moment to recreate America, and that, I guess, is to me one of the most exciting things. That when the framers, or the founders who wrote the Declaration of Independence and then went on to frame the Constitution, talked about their moment, they talked about how freaking lucky they were to get to write the history of a new country. And we're in the same position. So, take it with the joy you can, and let's just keep on moving forward.